I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you all here to BT Centre for the launch of the 2019 Oxford Internet Survey. I'm Jasmine Whitbread. I'm a member of the board here at BT, and I also chair the Committee for Digital Impact and Sustainability. So I have a real interest in the findings of this report today. And along with DCMS and Google, BT is really proud to have supported the Oxford Internet Institute in developing and delivering this report. I'm sure you'll agree with me when you get a chance to see it that the findings are an important and insightful addition to our understanding of the impact of the internet in the UK today. And there are many interesting and insightful salient points that will be covered in the speeches and the panel today, so I'm not going to steal their thunder. What I am going to do is just outline very briefly BT's current view on the impact of digital technology and the internet, which this report will help to further shape and enhance as we go forward. So we can all see and experience how digital technology is transforming every element of how we live. And for some, it can be hard to keep up with the rapid pace of change. And this can be the difference between getting ahead or being left behind. Right now, there's a digital divide and a skills gap that is having a profound impact on individuals, communities, and our economy as a whole. 63% of children who started school in 2016 are likely to do jobs that haven't yet been invented. 21% of those aged 15 or over in the UK population lack all essential digital skills. 75% of parents would like more support in helping keep their child safe online, and only 30% of the digital workforce will be women by 2022. 3 in 4 UK businesses report a digital skills gap, and we have an estimated £63 billion annual impact on the UK's future competitiveness. Quite some range of stats. That's why it matters that we shift the dial and increase the number of people with digital skills, because the current trajectory risks making social divides even wider at a time when we need to come together. It risks undermining economic growth at a time when we need to secure the UK's future prosperity. And inequality has become one of the defining challenges of our time. It threatens to undermine our economy and divide our society. We need to move towards a more inclusive system that works for everyone. And a key part of that is tackling the real risk of double disadvantage, so that digital skills don't become yet another barrier for people who are already struggling to get by. Now, it is possible for digital skills to help overcome divides in society, but only if we make sure that everyone has the motivation, the skills, and the confidence to succeed, no matter their background. At BT, we're using the power of communications to make a better world. A world where people are prepared for the challenges that tomorrow brings. As a leading tech company, we're determined to keep finding new ways to use our expertise, reach, and partnerships to support digital skills in this country and to motivate more people to want to get involved. We're the biggest investor in the country's digital infrastructure. We support 290,000 jobs across the UK. We're one of the largest providers of apprenticeships in the UK, with almost 6,000 apprentices currently learning with us. And we're also one of the largest R&D investors in the UK, an estimated £643 million in the last year alone. That's why we've put digital skills at the heart of our strategy on digital impact and sustainability. It will help grow the pipeline of digital talent. And of course, over the long term, it will increase the demand for our products and services. Our efforts are designed to start local, because we can have the biggest impact when we understand local needs and become a part of the system of support that already exists. And what's also important in shaping our plans is insight and data, which is why today's report is an important piece of the puzzle that will help shape our plans moving forward. At the close of this event, my colleague Andy Williams, BT's Digital Impact and Sustainability Officer, will go into more detail on our existing activities and plans in this space. But now I'd like to introduce and hand over to Professor Philip Howard, who is the Director of the Oxford Internet Institute. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I have a straightforward job, and that is to introduce my colleague, Dr. Grant Blanc. But let me start with a few comments by way of introduction about the Oxford Internet Institute. One of the things that makes us special is that we were built from the ground up to be interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary. We're about a third humanists and a third social scientists and a third computer scientists. And that makes us, as a department within a university, uniquely able to understand, to analyze the big trends in technology, its impact on society. The OII is the world's leading center of research on technology and public impact in terms of research and teaching. And very little of the work that we do would be possible without partnerships with industry, with government, with philanthropy. Pushing forward the envelope of science these days requires good partnerships. So let me thank and acknowledge BT for hosting us today. Thank you, Jasmine, for the support that you've given for OxIS. It's a real pleasure to introduce Grant, and I want to say one more conservative thing about Grant Blanc. I also think he's the world's leading researcher on the survey analysis of internet trends. For the last decade, he has taught our students, 80 students a year, stats, working with the world's largest data sets. He's either had a hand in designing survey research or playing with the data afterward in multiple democracies and multiple authoritarian regimes. It's a pleasure to have him as a colleague, and it's a pleasure to introduce him to present some of his latest research using the OxIS data. Please.
Thank you, Phil. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to talk about the 2019 OxIS Internet Survey. And just by way of introduction, let me start by giving you some background on the survey here. It started in 2003 when there was a realization at the Internet Institute that there was a need for fundamental information about the Internet and its use by the people in Britain. So we collected data in 6 waves between 2003 and 2013, all of which used about 2,000 respondents, collected data from England, Scotland, and Wales, with response rates of about 50%. The UK had the best internet data in the world at that point. And we have not collected data for about 6 years. We started here now in 2019 with a new data collection effort. Thank you very much to our funders here at DCMS, BT, and Google, who have supported this effort. The fieldwork here began in early February, ended in May, and it's a set of in-home interviews, about 40 minutes, so we have lots and lots of data. I'm part of the team here, but I'm also supported by research assistants from Julia Lefkowitz and William Dutton, who's a consultant. He was the founder of the OxIS survey back in 2003. So my presentation is going to be divided into 5 parts here today. First, I'm going to talk briefly about the demographics of internet use in 2019. Then I'll talk about activities on the internet, mobile-only internet use, privacy and risks, and I'll then summarize and give you some conclusions. In general, what I'm trying to talk about here are things that are new in the, with respect to the internet, that are different from the last survey in 2013. So there'll be some time for questions at the end. So we begin with this graph. This shows age by internet use. The vertical axis there is the percent who use the internet, and the horizontal axis is a set of age categories here. The top line is the 2019 data, quite appropriately. So you can see there's been an increase in all of the, across all of the age categories in internet use. But I'm going to pause here on this graph for a moment because the pattern is extremely interesting. What's happening here, you'll notice starting in about 2007, is the internet use percentages from the youngest people in the 18 to 24 bracket to about age 50 are flat. It's a flat line. The slope would be 0 if you ran a regression line through it. And then if you take a, at that point there's an inflection. It's an inflection point and the curve bends sharply downward. It's another linear relationship, but internet use drops at about 2 percentage points per year. There are a number of interesting things about it. First is that particular characteristic, that internet use up to about age 50 is very much the same, but also that across this entire period from 2007, these lines are broadly parallel. So they're just moving up equally across all of the different age categories. So what that's saying, to me at least, is that after age 50, there's something going on. The internet use, internet activities, being online is less valuable. It's less useful. It's less interesting to people. So they start to drop off. They start to use it less. But also the fact that these lines are parallel and they walk upwards steadily toward more internet use suggests that we're seeing an age effect. We're not seeing a cohort effect. We're seeing an effect of aging, and that means that we can't count on internet use climbing as people, as older cohorts die off. The fact that this inflection point has remained about age 50 over 10 years says that internet use after age 50 is changing because of age effects. So that's the first interesting point here. Second, we look at household income. Household income since 2005 here. Again, the vertical axis is the percent who use the internet. And the top line is the 2019 data set. Basically, what you see is a fairly consistent pattern. In 2019, the lowest income category, less than 12,500 pounds a year, about 60% of the population are online. Once you get beyond about 30,000 pounds a year in the two upper categories, essentially everyone is online. The other variations you see are probably just due to sampling variation. So what you're seeing is a very strong effect here of income. You see a similar sort of relationship with education. I'm not going to show the graph because it basically duplicates what you've seen. More educated people are more likely to be online, to the point where people with university degrees, 100% of them basically are online. So if we summarize, actually let me go back and summarize before I go to that next point. If we summarize the demographic part here, there's nothing really surprising. What we're seeing is a continuation of previous trends here. We're seeing that internet use is more likely among people who are better educated, who are younger, and with higher incomes. So with that in mind, let me go to the second part here, where I talk about activities on the internet. What we're seeing here is leisure, commercial, and entertainment activity on the internet. And the main story here is that almost all forms of consumption activities are increasing. And they're increasing very rapidly. If you look at things like paying bills, listening to music, watching movies, following celebrities, those have increased by fully 20 percentage points or more in many cases. So what that's saying is people are integrating the internet much more into their daily lives, into their daily activities. and even buying products, which is bumping up against the limit of the fact that it can't go above 100%, is increased by 5 percentage points. Now that's it's commercial activity and entertainment activity. Let me contrast that with content production. Now content production, you'll remember, is one of the major issues about Web 2.0, and it's given rise to a whole set of new ideas in terms of commercial activity, like collaborative consumption, the importance of consumer reviews, and things like that. What you're seeing here is that these activities have increased much less. If you look at things like posting your own pictures, reposting pictures, selling products, they've increased perhaps by 5 or 6 percentage points. In the case of selling products, that's been stable. If you look at writing a blog, it's actually declined by 6 percentage points. So what we're seeing here, just to summarize activity on the internet, is we're seeing a very sharp increase in entertainment and consumer activity, commerce on the internet. But content production has been much more stable, and it's even declined in several areas. This brings us to the question of mobile access. And the prevailing, about 15% of the population in the United Kingdom are mobile-only users, meaning they have smartphones and they access the internet only through their smartphones, not through computers. So there's a theory about smartphone access that says smartphones have small screens, they have limited processing capability, they have limited ability to do local storage. So as a result, they should be used mostly for entertainment, for watching movies, watching videos, and things like that. The OxIS data generally do not support this theory. If you look at this graph, you see the light-colored bars are the people who use a computer and a mobile smartphone. On the right side of each of those blocks of bars, the darkest blue bar are people who are mobile phone-only users, with computer-only users there in the middle. And what you see here is the people who use smartphones only to access the internet are actually much more like the people who also have computers. The people who are less engaged with the internet are not smartphone-only users. Instead, they are in fact the computer-only users of the internet. So this, generally speaking, is one of the more interesting findings here from the internet. This brings us to the question of experiences online. We look first, there's a perception here that the internet is a dangerous place and it's become more dangerous. We see virtually daily reports of data breaches, and in fact, if you look up under the tech tab on the BBC News website, you'll see something like 1/3 of the stories are some kind of data breach, or perhaps leaked bank details, revenge porn, Russian disinformation, or something like that. And last spring, the British government produced a white paper on online harms. But what does this say about the experiences of ordinary users? Certainly risks and harms are important, but how have ordinary users' experiences changed, or have they changed? In fact, if you look at these data here, you'll see that the experiences of ordinary users have been remarkably stable over the past 6 years. If you look at the most significant problem here in terms of financial issues, the credit card details stolen on the far right, that's been basically stable over the past 6 years. If you look at the far left, at the proportion of users who report receiving malware or a virus, that's actually declined by 18 percentage points. So what we're seeing here is bad experiences on the internet really have not changed at all. So what about perceptions of privacy and risk online? If you look at the left-hand side here, you see that about half of the population agrees that the internet actually threatens privacy. So it's not like they're not paying attention. But the proportion who are concerned, that second set of bars from the left, proportion who are concerned they might receive malware or virus has actually dropped from 69% to 52%. over the last few years. And then on the right-hand side, we have a couple of graphs about whether people have actually taken action to attempt to protect their privacy. And what you see is there in the far right, the proportion who've taken action to prevent receiving a virus has actually declined remarkably by almost 40 percentage points. So what you're seeing, this suggests that most people are not terribly concerned with the risks that they're running online. Now, this does not mean that people are unaware of privacy issues or unconcerned to protect their privacy. If you ask them about targeted advertisements and whether they approve of companies tracking their use of the internet and using that information for commercial purposes, you see here in the two left-hand columns, 68% of respondents, over 2/3, say they are either not comfortable or not at all comfortable with the use of their data for targeted advertisements. So there's very large proportions dislike targeted advertising and the use of tracking data for commercial purposes. So this is a story about risks and privacy from the point of view of users. People have not experienced or perceived a large increase in threats to their privacy or online risks. Concerns about privacy have tended to remain unchanged. Now, we didn't ask this question about targeted advertising in 2013, but I suspect it has not changed either. So this leads us, we've been talking about users, but what's the non-user story here on the internet? How do non-users understand privacy and their relationship to privacy online? Since they're not online, you could argue that perhaps they're unconcerned with online privacy issue. But it does touch the issue of why they're not online. And if we compare the level of concern of users with non-users, we find that non-users here on the right-hand bar are 20 percentage points more likely to say that the internet threatens their privacy than users are. So non-users are considerably more worried about their privacy on the internet, even though they're not personally involved in the internet. We ask here also the question about the reasons why people say they're not online. And in particular, we ask, what's the most important reason that you're not online? And a large majority say, as they have for the past 10 years, that they're just not interested or the internet is not for them. That's that far left-hand set of bars. That's declined a bit since 2013, but it's still a very large majority. But what's interesting here is if you look at the middle set of bars there where people cite privacy worries, the privacy issues have risen to 10 percentage points here. So non-users who have no practical experience online have to depend more on media reports about what's happening online. And the whole series of reports and stories about privacy breaches and risks of being online may be having an impact here, that their perceptions of the risks of being online are rising, and they're seeing a significant increase in the possibility that if they went online, they would have privacy problems. And so now a larger proportion of them are saying the most important reason they're online is because of privacy worries. So to summarize here, the users remain better educated, younger, and with higher incomes than non-users. That's consistent with everything we know about internet research since it began a generation ago. Activity online shows very rapid increases in consumption, entertainment, and leisure activities. Users are integrating the internet into their daily lives more and more. We're seeing that steadily increasing. So the internet's becoming more important to them. On the other hand, the content production of Web 2.0 style issues are mostly stable or declining. We see mobile-only users, smartphone-only users are actually not much different from users who have both a smartphone and a computer. In terms of privacy and risks, Bad experiences on the internet seem to be stable or possibly declining, as are perceptions of risk. Most non-users are offline because they don't care, they don't see any advantage to being online, so they're offline by choice. And among non-users, there's some perception of a rise in privacy dangers. So what can we conclude from this? First is there's a widening gap between users and non-users. Non-users remain convinced that there's nothing interesting on the internet, while users are becoming more intensive users of the internet. To the extent that there are benefits from the internet, things like saving money, saving time, access to information like health information, ease and simplicity of communication, finding jobs, influencing the political system, then these sorts of benefits are accruing to users and not to non-users. Users can claim them disproportionately. So there is a sense in which non-users are becoming an underclass, a lumpen proletariat of people who are poor, less educated, with lower incomes. They pay more for products, they have less access to information, they have less access to the political system. So we started here with the title of this report, raising the question of online threats to privacy. And the split between users and non-users is, I think, exacerbated by the succession of reports about privacy breaches, fraud, and security problems on the internet. This has created, at least among a small group of non-users, the perception that privacy problems outweigh any of the benefits that they might get from being online, so they stay offline. In this sense, privacy problems contribute to perpetuating the digital divide. So, thank you for listening. Now, I believe I have time for a few questions here. So, anyone like to ask any questions about the report? Sure.
I'm just interested in the bad experiences online question. So, the conclusion of your question and the responses you've got is that harm is not increasing. So, from 2013 to now, it looks fairly stable. But do you think you're asking the right questions? Because you've got things like, viruses, phishing emails, and spam. Those feel like yesterday's issues, whereas today's harm issues are more things like addictive behaviour and mental health problems, exposure to upsetting content, bullying. The world's moved on from viruses as being kind of key problem with accessing the internet. So do you think you're capturing the types of harm that might actually have risen since 2013?
We have a whole set of questions that we asked in 2019 about various harms, including things like bullying, like having seeing harmful images or videos online and things like that. The problem with presenting them here is we didn't ask them in 2013, so we have no comparative data. So when we run the next wave, we'll have comparative data on lots of things there. And what they show, broadly speaking, however, is quite low levels of harm, that people don't really see a lot of this. Even the questions that I would have thought would have been very common, like seeing images, hateful images or hateful language, turn out to occur, if I'm remembering correctly, to only about 35% of the population. So it's less than half, and probably about a third seem to fit that category. Mm-hmm. Yes, here.
Grant, do you feel that there is something happening as well with people remaining narrow internet users because of concerns about privacy and online safety?
That's a very good question. Narrow internet users are certainly an issue. We have not looked at that directly. I think indirectly there's evidence here in my presentation, because you see that people are using a lot more, larger proportions of the internet are using the internet for commercial purposes and leisure purposes. So I think in general people are widening their their use of the internet. The question you're asking, though, about directly whether we can locate a group of people who both say that there are serious privacy problems and don't use the internet very much, we just have not looked at. And it's a very good research question. So thank you. Right, yes. There was another question there, yes.
I was quite interested in the just not interested category versus the do not know how to use it.
Right.
Do you get a sense that what sort of split there is of people actually just being fearful and that being almost falling into the category of do not know how to use it? I mean, are people just not wanting to admit that they have sort of challenges engaging with technologies or internet usage?
If people don't want to admit it, we don't have any way to talk about it, obviously, because we ask them questions and we depend on them giving us an answer that reflects their actual opinions, their actual experience as much as possible. The just not interested is a combination of a number of items there. We ask, people have choices. It's not for people like me, not for people my age. I think there are like 3 or 4 items that we combine into this just not interested category. The don't know how to use it is pretty much a standalone. Actually, no, there is 2 items there. One is I don't know how to use it, and a second is it's too difficult to use. Those are combined into that category. So it's possible, but if we have no way of determining that. I would personally guess, since this is very consistent with the data from Ofcom, and it's the data that we've been getting for 10 years, that the people it's probably a largely honest opinion that they look at the internet and they say, for whatever reason, I don't see anything that really moves me to make the effort to get online. So,
thank you.
Okay, are we running? How's our time running here? Okay, one more question here. Can we take that question? Yeah.
I was just curious to understand, when we think back from the first slide where we see that age also has an impact on
Right.
On usage, like how do you then think about it? The last question of non-user, the reasons they don't go online is because they're not interested. But it seems like before they used to be online and then they're no longer. So how can we think about that change in behavior?
There are a group of people who were once online but who are not online now, who are ex-users. They're depending on and they're across every wave here. They run around 3 to 6% of the sampled population. Part of them are older people, and you see that in this decline here. And that's partly what's happening there. There are a bunch of ex-users of the internet.
Okay. But where do they fall off from using the internet? What's the reason?
If we ask them why, you get, again, something similar. I have to say I have not done the detailed analysis that I need, but in general, the broad analysis that we've done says that people they say the same thing that the non-users say. I'm not interested. The older people do anymore, predominantly. We get a number of people, particularly who are ex-users in younger age brackets, who have disrupted lives, and for some reason they're moving house, or they've left school, or something or left a job where they had internet access and they haven't regained internet access. So that tends to be the pattern for younger people. It does occur among retired people as well, where they had internet access in their job and not at home, and so they retire and they drop out because they no longer have access.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much then. Good.
We're just checking that we have a panel, we all know each other. Thank you very much, Grant, for absolutely fascinating overview of these 2019 findings. My name is Nick Newman. I come from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, where we do an annual global survey specifically looking at news and information and how that's changing. That's why I'm here, but my role here is mainly to introduce and share a discussion with our distinguished panelists who are going to help contextualize what we've just heard. So there are 5 of them, and in the interest of time, I won't go into huge biographical detail, but I think you have that already. So on the far left, from the Oxford Internet Institute, we have Professor Bill Dutton, who, as you've heard, has been involved in these surveys right from the beginning. We have from British Telecom, Liz Williams, who is Director of Digital Society there. Ian McRae, Director of Market Intelligence at the Media and Communications regulator Ofcom. From Google, we have Katie O'Donovan, Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy covering the UK, and Professor Vicky Nash, also from the Oxford Internet Institute, where she's Deputy Director. Maybe just to sort of kick off and pick up on some of the sort of main themes, one of the most striking statistics for me in the main report was actually that of users, 79% think that technology makes things better overall, despite, as we've heard, all of these discussions in the press about online harms, about privacy breaches, so-called fake news, and all the rest of it. Bill, how do we explain this? How do we make sense of this?
Well, and again, I think if you think back to the chart on activities online and that drop, the way I would express it is that this is the first survey that I've seen where you see the routinization and the embeddedness of the internet taking place. Before, it was a complement to more traditional ways of doing things. The internet is becoming the way we do things. And so from paying bills to banking and so forth, it is actually how we do things. And it's a really dramatic change. It's somehow in the survey, oh yes, it's rising to some percentage. But this is a huge difference now. And that's why, obviously, people are doing it, because it's easier to do things this way. And that's the way people, now again, the people who say it's more difficult are the older people. And lower income, and again, they do not have the support.
So it's that sort of intensification, but it's also, Liz, it's about the sort of convenience, isn't it? I mean, since 2013 to 2019, you've had things like sort of Netflix and online banking really sort of taking off, and that sort of convenience, I guess, in people's minds, sort of, they're setting that against some of these online harms that are emerging as well.
I'm not actually sure it is a point of convenience. If you think about for those of us that are online, from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment you go to bed, it is completely embedded in your life. And that's one of the reasons why I think Grant's research is so important, because it actually starts to properly underline this divide. And I love the terminology when you said, actually, we've got an underclass, because I think that's the really important part. When you talk to people at the moment, they'll very quickly go to these few people that don't have digital skills. They'll say it's my mum, but actually, it's a much greater group, and actually the impact of that is just so important that we lean in that and really understand those motivation issues. Otherwise, societally, this is going to be a very, very real problem going forward.
I mean, one of the points that was picked up from the audience is the sort of nature of online harms has changed, Ian. And, I know some of this is not revealed in this survey. So although some things haven't changed, like sort of the viruses and the malware, your research presumably does show that although people are happy, people are concerned about some of these newer issues, such as the privacy leaks and the sort of false news and misinformation, all these kind of issues.
Yeah, so the research that we've done 2 waves of research specifically looking into people's experience of and perception of online harms. One of them was done March last year, and another one done actually in the summer last year, and another one done March this year. One thing that we found was that there was quite a difference in the sort of the level of perception of harms, and we think that there's quite a danger in doing snapshot research, because people's perception of harms is so much driven by the media agenda at the time. But going back to your point of how harms have changed, then I think there are 2 things that I'd probably highlight, one of which is that the internet now is all about video, really. So, and with that brings a whole range of concerns about harmful content that we perhaps didn't have quite so much before. The other is in relation to children. We interviewed 12 to 15-year-olds and found that their main experience of harm was through harmful online conduct, so online bullying rather than the content itself. And the sort of the rapid growth in the use of social media by teenagers and children since 2013, I think has brought a whole new sort of category. And even when you ask the adults what their main concerns are about the internet, it's primarily about the protection of children.
And I mean, I think that point about video is really interesting because that obviously has been one of the huge changes we've seen. Again, it was noted in the report how many more people are posting videos and consuming videos. So Katie, from a Google point of view, I mean, obviously you run YouTube. Many of these issues of online harms have affected YouTube. How do you see both the changes, but also the sort of difference between the sort of convenience and the harms that emerge for you as a company?
Yeah, and I think it's, one of the reasons that makes this research and this panel so interesting is that it's an opportunity to sort of go beyond the very specific and very important focus that many people in the UK have had over the last couple of years on online harms and think about how that's embedded into our wider use of the internet. And one thing I would sort of just question very gently is whether much of the internet is about video or much of internet content is about video. And I think it's worth remembering in this report all the other things that people are doing online and all the other information and services and utilities they're accessing and performing. But I think when you think about the online harm element and the video content, a platform like YouTube has absolutely spent the last couple of years going on a significant journey to make sure that as more people are using the platform, as more content is being uploaded. And if you remember, the idea behind a platform like YouTube is to enable anyone to upload content, and that's something from, how to fix your dishwasher through to citizen journalism, as much in Warrington or in more challenging parts of the world. And within that, you have this great complexity. And so, rightly, a platform like YouTube has spent a lot of time thinking about whether it has, firstly, the right policies that are in place so that there are rules of the road for the content that's allowed. We haven't had to wait for legislation for that. We absolutely comply with the law, but then go further and say, actually, this type of content isn't allowed. And that would range from on YouTube, something like pornography, through to content that is seeking to inspire hate. We've then been able to use technology and machine learning to make sure that we can identify content at scale. And so if you look at very, very high areas of harm around terrorist content, actually we're now able to catch most of that before it's received a single view, which is transformational. Again, users can also flag content. They can see what's happened to that flag content, and we have 10,000 people to remove and reduce that. And so I think the focus on online harms is absolutely important. I think industry has to respond to that, and it has to demonstrate to people it's responding to that so they can use the internet with confidence. But I think where I'm excited to have a broader conversation is that while we're having those conversations and the scrutiny is serious, which is important, we also have this wider conversation about what the internet is about in the UK and what we want from it. And when we think about something like digital citizenship, how do we make sure that the harms are answered and we're protected from them? But we're also thinking about the digital skills that people who aren't online need and that people that are changing jobs need. And I think will be a massive transformation in the workplace over the next couple of years and couple of decades, and we need to be able to respond to that.
Let's we'll come to some of those points a little bit later, but just Vicky, to bring you into the conversation. I mean, I think that sense of, if you think about YouTube, it is amazing how there are so many sort of how-to videos and some of the positive sides of the internet on the one hand, which has really transformed since 2013, and then some of these new harms on the other hand. I mean, how do you sort of sum up this sort of dilemma about how we strike the right balance?
Yeah, it is very difficult. I mean, I think for me, one of the most encouraging things that I took from the survey is this headline figure of 79% of users thinking that technology is making things better. So even with the new data on new types of harms where maybe a third of people are seeing things like hate speech online, if people still feel, despite that technology is making things better, then I think we need to be very, very careful that our policy responses are going to be proportionate. So on the one hand, maybe finding ways of giving users more control to keep themselves safe, but also ensuring that those measures are not, if you like, so discouraging users from doing things like putting their own content online, finding things they themselves find valuable, and particularly around children. I think this is a real challenge that, this is an area where often, we have the greatest concern of younger users, vulnerable users, seeing things that may prove harmful. But at the same time, we know they use the internet perhaps more than the rest of us, and we want to make sure that we don't shut down their positive users too. So I think for me, it's about proportionality. I'd hope we might also touch, though, on some of these privacy questions in a bit, because I think the online harms angle is one perhaps that we're starting to wrap our heads around really quite well, and there's a very sophisticated debate about this. I think the privacy debate in policy terms, not so much.
Let's talk about the privacy now, because I personally found it sort of fascinating. About half the users think that the internet threatens privacy, but it hasn't really changed that much since 2013. What are we to make of this? Have we overestimated the dangers, or is it that balance thing again, Bill?
Well, I hate to surprise you, but in 1984, half of the public, 48%, said that they were very concerned over the privacy implications of computing. So there's almost
no change.
And then it was, concern over privacy has been talked about as a mile wide and an inch deep. People will express concern, and they have always expressed concern, and it's an enduring effort and legislation and other to deal with this and protection problems. But when people want to get a plane ticket or want to
they're happy to give up their data,
or want a discount on their groceries, they're often willing to give up some level of privacy. But it's not just a matter of them doing this a lot. If you look at the data, you didn't see a table that I find particularly compelling, which is we asked people how important are various media to you. And this was the first time I've seen people rate the internet as more essential than traditional media. And even for entertainment, not just for information, but also for entertainment. So you have a major shift going on in not just in how we've embedded the internet. This is the way we do things, and it's actually better than and more essential to me than other media. So this is why it's so critical that we not just demonize a technology, but we have to somehow join up these discussions of harm and use. So, web literacy or media literacy is a way of doing this, but somehow it can't be a different department looking at harm and demonizing the internet, and another department talking about let's wire the UK, and
all of these things
deal
overlap,
with these
right?
in the same.
They're so
people.
closely related.
Yes.
Ian, you've done a lot of research into privacy. People are still giving up their data, leaving themselves wide open, but they're also,
I think there's just a bit of a paradox there in that you've got clearly quite high levels of concern about privacy, but as you say, you've got people saying, yes, I'm willing to give up my user data in return for getting free stuff. But then when you dig in, then you ask another question, say, well, do you mind if a firm sends you targeted advertising based on use of your personal data? And then, I think only 17% say, yeah, I don't mind. So it's sort of, there is that sort of lack of understanding, perhaps, of the business models that underpin the internet. And another part of that is that our research has shown there's actually quite low trust in some of the main internet platforms to use users' data responsibly. I think 43% of Facebook users said they didn't agree that they trusted Facebook to use their data responsibly. It was about a third of YouTube users as well, but yet they continue to use them. We find, perhaps not surprisingly, that most people admit that they don't read terms and conditions before accepting them. But we know famously that PayPal's terms and conditions at 34,000 words are longer than Hamlet. So there's lots going on,
right.
And I think people do find it quite difficult to sort of navigate the concerns they have with their
and some of that hasn't necessarily got easier. So we've introduced this sort of GDPR legislation, and that's just produced a whole load of sort of new online forms and pop-ups, and people just sort of clicking randomly. That's my sense of it. Is this helping? Is this helping people understand, or is it raising concern? Vicky, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I think actually it probably is a good sign that there is a sort of heightened awareness of privacy risks. And I know on the one hand we're worrying about the media dictating, if you like, the terms of people's internet use, encouraging people to feel too fearful. But I do think actually the privacy one is where we could do with raising people's awareness and understanding more, as Ian's just suggested. I think, though, so there's another table, actually, I think in some of the papers I saw, where actually it discussed which actions people had taken to protect their privacy, and people had said that they did things like they had hidden their marital status, or they'd hidden their address or their contact details and so on. And I think that's very encouraging, but it also made me reflect on the fact that actually the tools that we give people to protect themselves online are actually still very, very sort of underdeveloped. And that actually, for me, I think there's a sort of a big debate that we're going to get to in the next couple of years with things like the Information Commissioner's Office looking at the operations of actually big data brokering companies, where I think individuals are going to have to learn and perhaps be rather shocked about the sort of the great scale of data which is collected about them through every sort of key click, every device they use, every website they visit. I mean, I think a lot of the focus from a policy perspective is on how you give information about yourself on social media, and that is a very small portion of the data that we give up on a daily basis. So I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, and in this survey, 68% said they were concerned about targeted advertising. Right. And I mean, Katie, that's pretty. I mean, that hasn't changed. That's a real indictment, isn't it, of the digital advertising market? And Google, of course, is a huge part of that.
Yeah, and I think that I would agree with a lot of the points that have been raised so far. That there's, people obviously are persisting and continuing and increasing using the internet, and advertising for a company like Google is how we are able to provide all of our services for free, and that for us is a really important principle. That one of the reasons I would argue that virus protection or risk of virus has gone down is because all of our browsers, which are available to everyone for free, has virus protection built in, and you can see the economic impact of all of the free services that are offered online are really significant to the whole UK economy. I think it's about 0.75% of GDP, as much as they are personally important. So I think I would argue certainly that advertising has a really important part to play in the online ecosystem, because it allows us to deliver services for free. It allows lots of publishers who create great content to receive revenue for that. But again, does that mean anything goes? Absolutely not. And I think that's where we absolutely have a responsibility. Well, firstly, I think policymakers have risen to that responsibility, and so GDPR, only came. It
doesn't make much difference, does it? I mean, I run focus groups, and people still basically think they're being tracked around the internet. They don't know how it happened, and they don't like it.
And I think it's interesting that I can't actually remember where we are now, 6 months or 18 months into GDPR coming into force, and that it certainly, I don't think it's shifted the dialogue either. I don't think you have discussions like this which start with, well, hang on a second, what was the protection that GDPR built in? But it did, and it has, and I think though it doesn't inform the specialised or in fact the general debate on that. But I think that's
it's a start.
Point.
It's a start.
And then companies like ours absolutely have, multiple levels of responsibility. I think the first is building the right tools. And so we do have a product called Google My Account, which is very intuitive to use. It can tell you what information we have on you, what information you would like to share, what adverts you would like to receive, if you want to receive personalised adverts at all. Now, we advertise that across our search engine, or, if you're logged in for different things, and have had a phenomenal number of visits. But I think, undoubtedly we could do more to educate people on that.
I want to move on to the question of digital divides. I know this is something that BT you're extremely concerned about, and actually there's quite a lot of positives in this report. So, in general, but in this regard, it's pretty depressing, isn't it, that we're making so little progress in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the issue is that it's not a problem of supply. There are loads of things out there. I mean, I'm chair of the Good Things Foundation. We run a UK network of online centres. BT's a supporter, but actually, there are loads of things out there that people can do. I think it's this question of motivation and people having desire and to be able to see the need. And there's 5.9 million people in the UK that don't have the essential digital skills, and that number is not moving. It's certainly not moving fast enough. So I think there is a whole, Grant's point about this underclass, I think it's a very, very real issue. The other thing I was just going to say is I think it's really important as well to look both ends of the age spectrum here. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is, you know, if you accept, as we do, I think we do, that we live in a digital world, actually how we equip young people from a really young age in schools to be able to work in this digital environment, to have the interrogation skills, the problem-solving skills, to be able to go in there and really see what's in front of them. I think that's an incredibly important part of our education system. It's one of the reasons why we've spent a huge amount of time and effort working with with BCS, the Chartered Institute for IC, on the Barefoot program in primary schools, because, you know, Jasmine made the point about young people doing jobs that haven't been invented yet, but they also are going to need different skills going forward. And they're living in a world where actually their parents don't have necessarily the skills to be able to equip them for the future that's ahead of them. So the role of education has never been more important for our young people.
Ian, do you see the similar, in your data, do you see similar trends around an underclass, and where, if so, where are you most worried?
Yeah, I mean, I think the data in the report on non-users broken down by income was interesting. We note that as well. I think it's actually quite shocking, frankly, that 14% of working age adults in the socioeconomic group DE don't use the internet.
And the ones who could benefit most from job opportunities or whatever.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, that's just so essential to participation in the workforce and just generally. And then you see other things like we've seen tremendous use in the growth of online banking by people who have the internet. I think that those who have online banking use it on average 7 times a week. But the response to that is you see the closing down of high street branches, for example. So there's broad social issues around there. I mean, I think another question that is in the report is around the sort of the shift towards mobile-only households, and that's really a phenomenon that we've seen. I think 1 in 10 internet users only use a smartphone, but 3 in 10 only use either a smartphone or a tablet. And I think it is worth sort of teasing into. I'm not sure I quite buy that all the uses are the same. I certainly agree through applications like banking and things, but I think when it comes to making job applications, preparing a CV, then doing that on a phone or even a tablet is really quite difficult.
It is difficult, but it's interesting in countries we look at in Africa. I mean, mobile is the gateway. It is the access point. It is the easy device that enables people to access the internet, and perhaps the only access point. Bill, your sort of sense on these issues?
Well, I agree. I mean, I think I'm also concerned with mobile only. In our study of Detroit, use of the internet in Detroit, mobile-only users were really concentrated. Young people in Detroit are often only using mobile.
Do you think that's a problem that people
are
in?
Definitely. And,
why?
Well, I mean, there are kids that go to school and write their essays on their mobile phone and not have a laptop and so forth. And they, anyway, but they think there's a potential for people using a mobile only. And I imagine some people in here are essentially using the mobile only. But you begin to think, I can do anything on my mobile, and I don't need to use a laptop or a desktop computer. But in terms of writing a project report or something like this, where an essay, it's important. But I think the thing that, just to make sure we don't lose this, I think it was between the lines in a number of comments. There are different cultures of users, and users are not at all alike. And so we have, there are what we've called immersives, who are really online all the time. There are, at the other end of the spectrum, there are what we call adigitals. And these are old people like me but I'm actually very much online.
You're not typical, Bill.
But who don't want to be online, but they have to be online. They know that they have to get email from the office or whatever, but they don't like it. And so they'll do as little as possible online. But the
problem is they don't see the value, right? I mean, Vicky, what can we do to help them see the value? There's a lot of services that could be helpful to them. I mean, it can't just be about education, right? I mean, what can we do differently?
Yeah, I mean, over the years we've talked about the internet being an experience technology. So it's this idea that you don't really know what it's good for until you try it. So I do think that certainly for those individuals perhaps that have never really tried it, don't think it's interesting to them, one of the keys has just got to be finding ways of getting them in, showing them what it can do, but importantly, what it can do for them. I mean, I think for me, one of the reasons why this focus on different internet cultures, for example, is so important is because actually what each of us do with our online presence each day is going to be very, very different. And so I think if you sort of try and just sell it as a package of you just have to be online because it does X, Y, and Z, you know, you're not going to have much of an impression. Whereas if actually you can really try and tailor it to the types of experience, you know, if you're trying to work, for example, with over 60s, you're going to have to offer a very different set of sort of functions and activities than if you're working with, you know, sort of disillusioned, unemployed individuals in their 30s maybe who have literacy problems. So, you know, I think it really is about sort of tailoring it and personalising the experience and showing people what it can do.
Yeah, Katie, thoughts about, you know, how we can bridge this?
Yeah, I think Grant summed really nicely when he said, you know, the benefits of the internet are being accrued, you know, obviously by the users and therefore excluding the non-users. And this is something we started thinking about at Google 4 or 5 years ago, where, you know, we saw massive investment and support and infrastructure for Silicon Roundabout and, you know, everything else for London startup scene, which is fantastic. But that those benefits weren't being seen by, you know, a plumber in Basingstoke or somebody else who doesn't see themselves as a digital business, but absolutely can use the digital infrastructure to thrive. So we set up a program called the Digital Garage, which has been going now for 4.5 years and it is usually based out of London. We've been to about 500 different venues. We're in Sunderland at the moment and we stay at places sort of between 3 to 6 months. And it started off as a program for small businesses, trying to encourage them to use the internet more, and has evolved and actually working very closely with the Good Things Foundation into a program that helps anyone do more online. And that might be go from one job to another, it might be apply for a new job, it might be develop new skills. And I think, you know, in some places we've struggled to get people in through the door because actually finding the right motivation, finding the right way to appeal to them is really challenging. And I think that to me speaks to a broader policy problem, that if you look at, you know, CDE users on a income of, you know, 12 to 15,000. If we were stood here talking about health outcomes or education outcomes or access to transport, that group have challenges in every single area. And so that's where actually a cohesive response from government that looks at opportunities for people in that group is needed alongside the action that companies and charities and others can take, because, you know, they're a group that have faced the most challenges in society and therefore need a really joined up response.
So I'm just going to ask each of you briefly to sort of sum up some of your thoughts, but particularly looking at sort of solutions and what governments or platforms could do differently. I mean, where do you think this data leaves us? Where should we be thinking about in terms of our policy responses? Bill, do you want, yeah, Liz, do you want to kick off?
Do you want to go first?
Well, I won't sum up, but I would say that one thing that hasn't been said is I wouldn't even demonize targeting users.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously people have hated telemarketing. I actually told one of my younger colleagues about telemarketing. She said, "What is that?" But back in the old days, telemarketing, everybody got ads in the mail, right? But targeted advertising is a problem, but people don't like advertising.
Yeah.
But targeting people, I mean, and knowing what people are looking for can be valuable. It can help you find directions someplace. They have to know where you are in order to give you directions to where to go. You need to know, you know, that
there's the two sides of the coin,
yeah,
right?
if you're looking for climate change data, you don't want to get information on air conditioners.
But the issue is whether people are in control, right? And the transparency around it, and that's the problem, right?
But also newspapers and media are certainly going to look for targeting, because as digital television becomes the mode, more and more television content is going to be targeted and therefore
and they
more
will need
valuable.
To personalize their services. Netflix already do it.
And they see that
Liz.
as a way to keep in business.
Liz.
And I think that actually, just picking up on that personalisation point, I think that's also part of this solution to how you get more people to actually see the benefits online. Actually, we're all different. Every single one of us is different. And therefore, what my motivation for going online versus yours versus anybody else in the audience will be different. We've done some work recently with the creative industries looking at this. And actually, the way to get to people is certainly through passion. It's through the things that matter to them. So, you know, if you are interested in, I don't know, tractors, then you get to that person through tractors. Whereas actually, if you're trying to find a job, it's about helping you understand how being on. So it is about a very, very targeted approach into individuals through the things that matter to them and just showing them the benefits it can bring them.
Right, Ian.
Yeah, I think just sort of 2 points. I mean, I think firstly the sort of challenge of digital literacy is is enormous, and it is a key public policy challenge. And I was quite struck by the data that sort of showed that I think of non-users of the internet, I think 18% in 2019 said that it was sort of they didn't feel they knew how to use it, and that was almost doubled from 2013. And I think there's a perception that the internet is getting more complex, and I think that's a major challenge. I was actually quite encouraged by another little bit in the report that said that people are using public libraries more than they used to, which I was nice to see. I was slightly surprised. But, and my sort of second point, which is a bit related to that, is around informed consent and privacy settings. In that I do think that, as Katie has said, that there's lots of efforts from platforms like YouTube, like Facebook, to give users some sort of control over their privacy settings. I think there's still a sort of a little lack of understanding for people of what that actually means. And I mean, we know that sort of 7 in 10 people say, yeah, they know about cookies, but they don't really know. No. And I think there is just this sort of information asymmetry, which is that when you're asked for permission to give your permission for your data to be used, an ordinary person, or even quite a sophisticated, educated person, is not really in a position to give that consent because they don't really understand what it's being used for. Yeah. And I think that's a huge challenge.
Huge challenge, yeah.
Just as an anecdote on that, I recently, one teacher sat through and showed me one of the courses that's on Barefoot, and they showed me how a search engine worked. And I can tell you that little vignette is aimed at sort of 7-year-olds. I learned a huge amount from it. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
Anyway,
so you need a YouTube how-to video. Perfect. Katie.
There are YouTube
I'm sure
videos on that.
On everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your question was, what should we take from this discussion? It's been a really interesting discussion, particularly first thing on a Monday morning. Yeah. And for me, and I of course would say this first point, that 79% of people who think the internet makes things better. That's something we should all really celebrate and have as our basis for thinking things through. I think then I would like to kind of go on something Vicky said, which is around, actually, if we use that as our basis, what does that mean that we do, and where's the proportionality in that? And I would really like us to shift to a wider discussion about digital citizenship, and I think that includes, what does that mean for digital literacy? What does that mean for workplace and older people's skills? What does that mean for people really having control of their data and really, feeling empowered and understanding what that means so they can use the internet with confidence, and making sure it's a much more participatory debate.
And Vicky, finally.
Thank you. So I suppose there's 2 policy points that I take away from this. The first is I just echo that point that Grant brought up at the very beginning, which is that, based on the data we have now since 2003, the internet doesn't show signs of reaching, sort of 100% penetration. It's not, non-use is not going to go away. So in terms of design of public policy and digital services, we need to make sure that we don't move just to digital by default. We need to make sure we cater for everybody. But the second also would be just reflecting on this pattern about dealing with risks and dealing with harms. I think it's very positive that some of the harms, some of the risks that we thought were really quite substantial maybe 10 years ago, we seem to have managed to sort of to decrease through, again, good partnership working between government, industry, educators, and parents and so on. So, I'd hope that we'd have a similar story to tell around some risky content perhaps in another 10 years if we work together.
Fantastic. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. Should we... 2 questions. Okay, we'll take two questions from the floor. I'm going to go here first, which is a challenge for you can throw this lovely BT square.
Thank you. I wondered if I could pick up a point that Ian was making about these information asymmetries in the market. Normally, I thought it was the job of regulators to correct such information asymmetries, and particularly in the debate on privacy, why is it that we have the onus is always on the individual to protect our own privacy? We don't expect any of us to protect our clean air or clean water. That's the job of regulators to do so. Should we not have a collective privacy rights?
That was for you, Ian, I think. I think it was very specifically for you.
I think it was, yeah. So I agree that there's huge sort of regulatory challenges, and which the government is engaged with, and there is this sort of question really of Information Commissioner's Office clearly is the regulator with responsibility for responsible use of data. Organisations within the communication sector are important in sort of driving that, and we need to work very closely as regulators with government to think about through what those issues might be. I mean, the specific duties that Ofcom has in relation to media literacy are part of that story there, i.e. Raising awareness of what those issues are for government, other policymakers to understand and to take action, and also for consumers to understand what's available. But I agree with that sort of point of that however much information is given, it's almost the more information that's given, the more consumers can get confused. So there are obligations that are on providers to manage that data responsibly, and the GDPR is a huge step forward in relation to that. But I think we still haven't quite got to this place of it is that sort of 79% of people happy with the internet. Internet business models driven by the availability of free stuff that is driven very generally by advertising. 13.5 billion pounds advertising revenues in the UK from the internet. That compares to 5 billion for television. It's absolutely huge, and the internet won't work without it. But there is this lack of understanding of how it works, and I think there's a two-part stage, two parts to addressing that challenge. One is improving information for consumers about what consent they're giving, and the other is to provide to those collectors of data to make it very, very transparent in ways that consumers can understand and give informed consent.
Thank you. I think we've got room for just one more, and just literally behind.
Hi. One of the questions I had was around, I guess, the role of voice assistants and the collection of data and privacy concerns around that, and I guess the responsibilities of people embracing the kind of benefits of adopting this sort of stuff versus the whole kind of challenge you have with privacy in that respect, and is it always listening? That sort of thing. I was just keen to understand the thoughts.
Voice assistants in our data is growing incredibly quickly. About 14% in the UK have these devices now. People concerned about privacy. Bill, any thoughts on
well, I think
the specific challenges of voice?
I think it is 20% in our data, right, Grant? It's 20% of the individuals we surveyed had a voice-assisted search or voice, one of the voice assistants. And yes, it is a search, the perception too, because I've even told my family to be quiet at one point because we're arguing over something in front of our Google Assistant. But so yes, it's a perception, and because it's a new technology, and
it's
we
the
have
same
to
thing,
get,
right? It only works because it's listening,
yes,
and you only get the benefits. So it's the same challenge, really, of how do you empower consumers, how do you regulate this thing appropriately, and I think that neatly brings us on to the next stage of our
and learning how it
discussion.
works and how it begins to listen and how people monitor it for testing and so forth. But
thank you.
All
Thank
news
you.
technology.
Thank you very much indeed to our panel for some great insights. So Bill, Liz, Ian, Katie, and Vicky. Thank you very much. Put your hands together for the panel. So lots of issues to consider for society, for platforms, but also for government. And in that regard, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce the Minister for Digital and Broadband, Matt Warman.
Well, thank you ever so much for that. It was fascinating watching the panel in the green room just before I came in here. And I used to be a journalist writing about technology for the last best part of a decade. And I always can't help looking at things like this and think, how would I have pitched them to my editors a few years ago? And I hate to say it, the answer in the case of this year's Oxford Internet Survey, or this round of Oxford Internet Surveys, is that difference between students thinking they have excellent internet skills, 95%, plummeting to 77% as soon as people are in employment. It strikes me that this is conclusive proof of the value of work to self-awareness. But that is probably not the real headline in this. And we all know that the internet and technology is having a huge impact on society, and it presents unprecedented opportunities, and those opportunities are hugely diverse. And I think it's worth saying that perhaps the narrative has become a little bit too skewed on what are the risks and the harms, and we risk losing sight of two things. Firstly, it's the hugely positive impact that the web and the internet have had on our society as a whole. But also it's the fact that government has to work together with the industry in order to address the challenges that we've got. And so the talk of an increased fear of online harm, the talk of an increased reality of online harm sometimes has to be balanced with what else we're going to be able to do thanks to the internet. So I'm a huge optimist, and I don't want to pretend I'm the sort of utopianist that was referred to in this survey, but I do think we need to try and redress a little bit of that balance. And we know that many people can't access these opportunities for a variety of reasons, and government, as was mentioned on the panel, is committed to unblocking those things. And the Oxford Internet Surveys are a crucial part of research that shines a light on how we do that, how people use the internet, and the benefits and the barriers. And that's why the Department of Culture, Media and Sport has supported this year alongside our hosts BT and Google, and I'd like to thank BT and Google in particular. But the survey shows how so many people enjoy the benefits of being online and are regularly buying products and paying their bills and following their favourite celebrities, and all of that is a good thing. But it is also encouraging to see that the low level of perceived risks does result in some part from a lower level of receiving viruses or malware or whatever that. And as I said, some of that is down to huge technological progress. It's not simply down to a diminished perception of risk. And it is also reassuring to see how few people are having their credit card details stolen or receiving abusive emails at the same low levels as they are in 2013. But as though to illustrate the problem, if I were to tell my colleagues in Parliament that the number of abusive emails is the same as it was in 2013, they simply wouldn't believe me for a moment. So some would say that that's a self-inflicted wound, but there we are. From today's report, we can see that internet users have intensified their engagement with those online activities, and at the same time, there is a small but persistent number of people who resolutely avoid the internet and take the view that it isn't for them. And as we were discussing, or as the panel was discussing rather, that means that the benefits of the internet that we perhaps in this room are all familiar with, like saving money and time and access to health information and all that stuff, is not benefiting others. And it's obvious that the people who would benefit most from this, if you look at the data around demographics, around education, the people who would benefit most are the people who are not benefiting. And understanding the motivational barriers to internet use and tech adoption has to be key to an inclusive future. But I think it's also important to say that government can't just stand by and say, what can we do to help the people who are hard to reach in many ways what can we do to reach those people online as well? We do have to try and, I think, address what it is that government can do to encourage people who are unwilling for reasons where we might be better off trying to explain the benefits without necessarily making it too easy to avoid using the web. Because I think it's important that we do say someone using an online service rather than from a public point of view, someone using an online service is not only saving themselves time and money very often, but they're saving every other taxpayer time and money. So if they are not people with entirely legitimate reasons, I think government has a duty to encourage a little bit more as well. And how different sectors of society use different methods to access content and perform tasks online must influence how we talk about that digital inclusion. So we know that smartphones can be lifelines for older and disabled people, giving a new independence to them. And people who were previously much more reliant on other channels are now increasingly digital. It's yet another reason to invest in 5G and all of those things that will take this even further. So all of us have to ask ourselves, I think, are we, whether it's in government or elsewhere, designing new products and services with those hardest to reach users in mind, and what are we doing to try and get to them? Are we ensuring that websites are not only mobile enabled but also accessible to people with access needs? And the report shows that voice assistants have now reached 19% of households, and it doesn't, or at least in the version I've seen, it doesn't break down that bit by demographics, but I would be inclined to assume that those 19% tend to be the more affluent households that have luxury products, when actually we know that there's also a huge benefit, for instance, to old people with audiobooks, disabled people using devices that they couldn't if they had to use anything other than their voice. So it's benefits such as these that we need to ensure are accessible to everyone. So we need to make sure that we're communicating these benefits in the most effective ways. And understanding that people who are digitally excluded, and understanding people who are digitally excluded and their needs will allow us to create the right support for those who are most excluded, and crucially ensure that we're couching the many fantastic offers of support in terms that are clearly understood by those who will benefit from them most. And this, as was mentioned again on the panel, I think is an important role for government. Our own Digital Inclusion Innovation Fund, which launched at the beginning of this year, focuses on older and disabled people, two of the most digitally excluded groups, and particularly those who are geographically isolated as well. And one of the schemes which won funding supports smart homes in a rural area where tech-savvy older people have their homes fitted out with smart tech and are trained in how best to use it. And this clearly isn't an approach we could take with literally everyone across the country, but it's an important trial to see what we can do. And these digital boomers, as they're known, welcome their older peers into their homes to share the benefits of smart tech, perhaps over a cup of tea, but are introduced as younger digital buddies who can support them over the longer term on a digital upskilling once the original interest has been piqued. And it's an example of sort of normal social interaction being used as a way to drive adoption that benefits everybody. And that kind of experimental approach will allow us to learn and share what works for excluded groups in improving what is, for some, simply digital confidence, but for others is not. And the experimental innovative pilots will also allow us to identify on a smaller scale what may or may not work for these groups so that funding available to support them is used most effectively. And on a larger scale, government, of course, as we've talked about over many years and over many governments, is committed to tackling digital exclusion and closing digital skills gaps across the country. But we can't do that alone. And a collaborative approach is what's needed to bridge those gaps. And so the Digital Skills Partnership is a particularly good example, I think, of local and national government, private sector, civil society working together to train people to ensure that skills support reaches everyone. It's never going to get to 100% of people, but I think it can make crucial differences. And government's also introducing an entitlement to fully funded digital qualifications from next year, which again is an important step, putting digital qualifications alongside maths and English. So adults with no or low digital skills will have the opportunity to undertake new digital qualifications free of charge. But we also need to realise that it is not simply the charge that is putting some people off using the internet, as the panel discussed a minute ago. And all of these interventions, whether informal support in local communities, whether formal qualifications in colleges or funding programmes for civil society, all of that needs evidence from endeavours such as the Oxford Internet Survey to prove that they make a difference. And to conclude, it's fantastic to see that there is such a diverse group in this room, from academia to industry leaders to civil society, all committed to trying to tackle that digital divide. And so I want to finish with two asks. The first is for us and those outside these walls to continue to work together to pool that knowledge, to understand digital exclusion and the digitally excluded better, and to use evidence and data at our disposal to communicate the huge benefits of digital better. And if we do this, I think we will be able to bring the benefits of digital to more people and allow them to reap the rewards both online and offline. But the second point I want to make is that it is clear, as the panel talked about a lot, that a number of people do question, thanks to the way advertising online works, how much they can trust major corporations and also how much they can trust government. I think there's a huge role for government, for the industry to work together to try and build models that are trustworthy and models that are trusted by the public. And it's clear from the survey here that there is some work to do on that. Government is already doing some of that work, but of course it has to come from all of us. So thank you again to all at the Oxford Internet Institute for launching what is such an important and interesting report. And thank you all for having me here this morning. Thank you.
I'm Andy Wales. I lead digital impact and sustainability here at BT, and my job to wrap up this morning, and I simply have 3 things to say. The first is to echo the thanks, and particularly extend thanks to Matt as the new Minister for Broadband and Digital Skills, for the research, for all of you on the panel, and for all of you giving up a leisurely Monday morning breakfast to join us here to discuss this. Thank you for joining us. The second then is from the BT side to emphasise the importance of this insight, because really understanding some of the interactions between the different issues, I think, is fundamental to them beginning to address these together or addressing them further together. And we all know the challenge of people who have a lack of basic digital skills, the impact in terms of what that means for the UK economy, something like £63 billion. 3 out of 4 businesses know they lack digital skills in their teams. But we need to understand a bit more about that sometimes. And I think it was interesting, the discussion this morning, Grant, about the research, about the different reasons for being offline and the interactivity of those different reasons. And certainly our research at BT with citizens and consumers has led to some really interesting insights about the connections between initially talking about not wanting something, but actually then the psychology behind feeling some fear of interacting in that, and ultimately then not really being sure how to do it and where to get those skills. And that's a big challenge for all of us, because lots of us invest in this space, lots of us invest in helping adults, older people, and young people get the digital skills they need. But if we're honest, the net sum of that at the moment together is not enough. So BT's done a lot of work with Barefoot in primary schools, training 70,000 teachers to then train more than 2 million kids in computational thinking, creativity, logical thinking. And that's okay, but we need to go much further. And so we'll be working with many of the partners here to take that further in schools, but also in teenage years, in adults, and in older and more vulnerable people. And I think that there's a particular challenge there around that a couple of elections ago was called the squeeze middle. But in a digital skills sense is the kind of set of working parents who actually have the pressure of their own kind of job in the future, their own skills, the media headlines they see all the time about automation and robotics. At the same time as being concerned about how they educate their kids, at the same time as thinking about how do they help their elderly parents or relatives or community connect in an online world. And I phoned my parents last night for my weekly catch-up. And they were asking about what I was doing this week, and I talked about this event we're having this morning. And I explained, that 82% of people online, 18% online. And immediately my dad said, well, that's because I'm not interested. And the conversation moves on. About 2 minutes later, he asked me to book a holiday cottage online for him. And so, there's an interactive piece there. And so I'm sympathetic to your point, Matt, around actually making it not too easy to be offline, because this is the way that people need to engage in many ways in the future. And so therefore, I think the third thing for me is a call to action, but a call to action to be, I think, a bit tighter and smarter about how we work together. And for companies, there's an opportunity and a challenge there. There's an opportunity because we speak to masses of people every day. BT is the largest consumer company in the UK, 30 million consumers. And so we need to do that through our brands. We need to actually get to our consumers through our brands and bring them into more of this digital skills access that is there. But at the same time, we need to not do it in too branded a way, because that can prevent you working together. Actually, we need to find better and smarter ways to work together to get more people on board. And so that's a challenge that we'll be taking forward in the next few months. We'd be delighted, we're working with many of you, we'd be delighted to work with many more of you on that. And we'd be delighted to support further research that actually helps us understand how to best do that. So thank you for joining us. Upstairs, you'll find tea and coffee and pastries, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.